Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Anatol Lieven, a former professor at Georgetown University and currently the director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So welcome back to the program.
Nice to be back.
So you recently co-authored this paper with the title Restoring Arctic Exceptionalism, and I will leave a link in the description. And well, I guess the premise of the argument then is that that the Arctic risks becoming a key geopolitical battleground for the great powers, and this is a new development, given that the Arctic has traditionally been exempted to a large extent from geopolitics, and instead it has served as an arena for cooperation and trust building. So what is it that made the Arctic exceptional in this way, and what is it that has actually changed?
Well, during the Cold War, the Arctic, of course, was not exceptional because, as once again today, you had huge nuclear forces directed against each other or against each other's homelands across the Arctic. And you had land-based missiles and, of course, nuclear submarines. And there was a whole genre of thrillers by people about, competing bases and submarines in the Arctic. After the Cold War, there was a period, unfortunately, in historical terms, a brief one, when, yes, there was this Arctic exceptionalism. And that was driven both by, obviously, the reduction in tension after the Cold War, but it was also driven by what is now driving the new competition in the region, which is climate change, which is melting the Arctic ice, and therefore allowing ships, commercial vessels and warships to sail much more freely across the, at least the fringes of the Arctic Ocean. But what I find absolutely crazy about all this is that in the first place, as I say, this competition is not new. It existed within the Cold War. It hasn't fundamentally changed because it really does not matter to the security of either side if more Russian and Chinese ships or American and Canadian ships can sail through parts of the Arctic. That does not mean that Russia is going to invade Baffin Island or Alaska. It doesn't mean that America is going to invade northern Siberia. This remains not even a maritime competition exactly, because, so the ships sail to and fro. Now, it's true, of course, that there is competition over access to undersea resources, although, thank God, that has not actually begun yet. There was a hope, of course, that, like the Arctic could be declared off limits to undersea drilling, but that was perhaps a faint hope, and Trump has now destroyed it completely. But for me, the absolutely insane thing, and I use that word advisedly, I think this is how our descendants in 100 years will view us, is that this whole issue or non-issue has been created by climate change, which is melting the ice. Now, many of the Western security analysts who are desperately hyping up, this new strategic competition in the Arctic, are either deniers of climate change or totally indifferent to its wider effects. They never write about it. But actually, the briefest, the most superficial look at this issue will tell you, will show you, that the threats, not just to the world and humanity in general, but to our own countries from climate change in the Arctic, are greater by several orders of magnitude than any threat in that region from Russia and China, because the Arctic is warming more than 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And the Arctic is home to 3 out of the 4 so-called tipping points or issues that could change climate change from an incremental process into a runaway process by leading to feedback loops, which would essentially make climate change uncontrollable and turn 2 degrees into 3 degrees, 3 degrees into 4 degrees, until modern civilization, even conceivably the existence of the human race, could be in danger. And those 3 issues are the melting of the Arctic ice and the Greenland ice cap, driving sea levels to radically higher levels. By the same token, the melting of the ice cap reducing the reflectivity of the sun's rays into space, and the melting of the Arctic permafrost, leading to huge releases of methane, which, although it doesn't last in the atmosphere for nearly as long, in the short term has a greenhouse gas effect almost 40 times that of carbon dioxide. The fourth issue, which is not directly in the Arctic, although it will be hugely influenced by weather patterns stemming from the Arctic, is the Amazon rainforest. But obviously, we won't get into that. But the point is, take Britain, my country. The last British national security strategy barely talks about climate change at all. It is in a small footnote, basically. And it goes on and on about the threat from Russia, the threat from China, the threat from the Middle East, although it doesn't mention Israel not once in that context. But there is, and we cannot, there is nothing certain about any of these predictions. But there is a chance, a non-negligible chance, that the melting of the ice in the Arctic will lead to a collapse of what's called the which is the key circulation current, or phenomenon process behind the Gulf Stream. Now, if that were to collapse, the climate of Britain and of Western Europe would go from its present temperate level down to the levels of Newfoundland, northern Canada. Is there anything that Russia wishes to do or could do short of nuclear war to Britain which would have, anything remotely resembling the effects of this? And yet the British establishment regards it as a minor side issue, while talking at length in this new national security strategy about the security threat in the high north. It seems to me that through a mixture of obviously history, long history of security issues being regarded as hard military issues, deep institutional interests and prejudices, and sheer moral cowardice. We are missing the point about the Arctic to a degree for which our descendants will never forgive us, if we have any.
Well, it also seems that in the past you had the activities in the Arctic that were very much a positive sum game by nature, that is dealing with climate, environmental issues, search and rescue, scientific work. All of this was focused on mutual benefit. But with this Arctic corridor, whose flag should the ship sail under, which maritime corridors will be under control of whom, and of course, I think, as you very correctly say, the vast amount of energy resources becoming available for extraction, suddenly all this zero-sum interests, which are instead entering. But of course, the war in Ukraine has not helped at all. In the Arctic Council, we can't even sit down and talk to each other anymore. I know there's many scholars working on the Arctic who quite sees this as a huge problem. But a lot of this began though before the Ukraine war. It intensified a bit under Trump's first presidency. I often hear the talk about Mike Pompeo's speech at the Arctic Council. I think it was back in 2019, because he essentially brought the geopolitics into it, and he spoke in manners which people haven't really spoken in the Arctic Council before, about countering China, countering Russia. Do, do you trace it back to the same period as well?
In part, but I have to say that this attitude is current throughout the US foreign security establishment and indeed European security establishments as well. As I say, bizarrely connected, especially obviously in the case of the Republicans in America, with a denial that climate change is happening. So on the one hand, climate change is opening the Arctic to this competition, but on the other hand, climate change doesn't exist. I mean, how any sane person can keep these two ideas in his or her head at the same time, it is. I mean, it is a comment on the kind of people who rule us today, which is profoundly depressing. But to this, of course, has been added this hysterical European moralism. Whereby if somebody in the world does something that we don't like, and we have good reasons, God knows, for not liking the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that means that they are so evil that we're not going to talk to them about anything. We're going to cut them off completely, and somehow this is both a sensible policy and it's a policy that will impress the rest of the world. Well, it doesn't impress the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is perfectly well aware that you could turn round, or certainly could have in the past, and apply the same standards to much Western behavior and to very recent American and British behavior, for that matter. If you get into this mood that a disagreement about one thing, even a very deep disagreement, leads to a collapse of nations across the board, well, sooner or later, the reasonable conduct of international affairs will collapse completely. Or it is the West that will find itself isolated, because the whole language of the Europeans and the Americans under Biden about all these moves against Russia and against Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that this has led to Russia's isolation. Russia must be isolated. Well, of course, if you look around the world, Russia is not isolated. The great majority have rejected Western attempts to isolate Russia. And indeed, I mean, of course, also now very much driven by Trump's, extreme bullying and coarseness, and the European subservience to this. It looks much more as if it is the West that is becoming isolated, insofar as the West still exists.
Well, it seems that the wider geopolitical rivalry these days is the US and its allies, seemingly with some goals to restore polarity. Not all, of course, but on the other side, you see this big movement of the Eurasian giants who keeps advocating for multipolarity. Now, I bring this up because China is also entering this, I call it Arctic race, or at least the geopolitics of the Arctic. Now, I think, China refers to itself as a near Arctic state. Some consider this to be, very creative in terms of geography. Others point to the river systems, and but irrespective of this, why does it matter that Beijing has also a growing role in the Arctic?
Well, I mean, when it comes to China claiming to be an Arctic power, although in fact it isn't, look at the United States. The United States claims to be, well, is in many ways a Middle Eastern power. America is what, 4,000, 5,000 miles away from the Middle East? It's certainly determined, as we see, to remain a Latin American power. Once again, I mean, the United States does not live in Latin America, and so it goes. So, China as a huge, by some counts, the biggest economy in the world, and obviously with a deep interest in international trade, has a role to play in the Arctic, whether we like it or not. Um, but more generally, yes. You have Western governments, some of them, European governments, and some writers, commentators in the West, recognizing and paying lip service to the idea now of multipolarity. I mean, Fiona Hill, one of the architects of the or authors or advisors on the British national security strategy, did say in Tallinn a couple of years ago that we must take account of the opinions of the rest of the world, and that they now matter much more in a way that they didn't before. But in practice, nothing comes out of this. In the British national security strategy, there is talk of, Britain's diplomatic assets in the Commonwealth, but actually there is no will whatsoever to take any account of what the actual views of Commonwealth countries are. And of course they sense that. So, and I suppose this is a familiar syndrome, as Roman power declined, so the declarations by Roman authors of the supremacy of Roman culture and how the barbarians, must respect imperial authority and Romanita became more and more shrill and hysterical. So precisely as our influence in the world does go down, so our claims to that influence, and its moral basis become more extreme.
Well, I did think it was interesting that the Chinese Arctic policy from 2018, the white paper on the Arctic, it labeled the transportation corridor through the Arctic as a polar Silk Road, because this seems to conceptually include the Arctic into this wider new Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Chinese are developing, which again can be seen as going back to the ancient Silk Road. Now, of course, during the one of the reasons why we call it the Barents Sea and all of was because you had the Dutch seafarers attempting to reach China by the sea 500 years ago. It didn't work; they got stranded. But well, long story short, this is a very new, I guess, addition to this Silk Road project. But it seems that some of the recent developments on the western side seeks to balance this. Now, I'm thinking then of the NATO expansion in Scandinavia, so including Sweden and Finland. I don't think it was primarily directed against the Arctic, but unavoidably it does affect the Arctic, doesn't it? With NATO expanding, and also the United States developing military bases across Scandinavia, and also developments now in the infrastructure to be able to move troops faster towards the Russian borders. Do you see any, I guess, dramatic reading or any big interpretation from this new NATO presence in the High North?
Well, I mean, the biggest threat to stability in that region by far recently has been Trump's claim, proposal, let's call it, to take Greenland from Denmark. I mean, that would indeed, cause, well, I mean, it would obviously greatly increase America's role in the Arctic. It would also cause huge problems with Europe. Now, the Trump administration seems to have gone quiet about that, but relatively quiet. But then again, of course, given that there are so few people in Greenland, 57,000, it would only take 1/10 of the US military budget to offer every single man, woman, child, infant in Greenland $2 million to accept American sovereignty. Now, I don't suppose they would. But I mean, the point is that it would be quite different if you had a huge Greenland population, but you don't. So I thought I'd just mention that because it does bring out the degree to which America is not just seen, but is a disrupting factor on the world stage. Because you hear so much about this axis of disruptors or revisionists or whatever, but you could hardly find a bigger example of revisionism than an attempt to take or proposal to take 840,000 square miles of somebody else's land. Now, beyond that, yes, God, I wish the Chinese would stop talking about this Silk Road. I wish just as these endless cliches out of the West, rules-based order, and so I wish they'd shut up about it all and think of something else to say. But what the Chinese are trying to do, of course, is develop routes to Europe, which, despite its economic troubles, does remain one of the three main economic regional metropolises of the world, that do not require a long sea route across, the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean or around Africa through seas which are basically controlled by the US Navy, or could be in the event of war. So, of course, one of these is the land route, and now, actually several different land routes. And the other is this plan for greatly increased trade through the Arctic. Although, I mean, the point being, of course, though, that an increased American military buildup would, in the event of war, make that route highly, well, not nearly as vulnerable as going through the Straits of Malacca and the Indian Ocean, but still vulnerable, although you would have, obviously, Russian forces to defend it. But, look, I mean, let's face it. Well, let's pray that in the end, as during the Cold War, all of this military posturing turns out to be theatre. Because, of course, if the only circumstances in which the US actually starts sinking Chinese vessels going through the Arctic, or for that matter, well, I suppose intercepting vessels, blockading vessels from China might be a different matter. But certainly if it came to a question of completely interdicting Chinese trade, maritime trade, that would only take place in circumstances of war. Well, I mean, if both sides are crazy enough to get into an American-Chinese shooting war, Chinese trade through the Arctic is going to be a side issue, if only because in those circumstances, Europe probably would be forced by America to stop, trade with China anyway. But I mean, most of all, this is something that would bring at best, bring the entire world economy down in ruins. At worst, of course, it would lead to a full-scale nuclear exchange and kill us all. So, so much of this is, it's military kabuki. And I have to say, America, those it really matters. Many years now, I've been deeply impressed security establishments, because there's so much talk of how we need to increase our military production. But what they've always been fantastically good at producing is paper. Endless reports, with titles like Germany's responsibility for the security of Central Asia, or Belgium's contribution to Indo-Pacific security. Got one Danish frigate now, following this British aircraft carrier around the Pacific because the British don't have enough escort vessels of their own. Well, I'm sure that employs the British. I haven't studied the Danish Navy, but in the British Navy, in the British submarine service, there are 11 admirals and commodores, which is a little bit funny since we only have 9 submarines. But my God, this is a great and employment plan for otherwise unpromotable naval officers who would have to retire 2 ranks lower. And I would make a very, very large bet that what 10 out of 11, maybe 9 out of 11 of these senior naval officers produce is paper. Paper which I'm not sure that I'm not even totally convinced that they read it themselves. Some of this stuff reads as if it could actually have been produced in the 1950s and then just given a new date and heading.
Well, what kind of thinking is it that influence, you think, the politicians, not just in Washington, but in the capitals of other great powers as well? Because many people would trace the dominant position of the West to the early 16th century when Western powers began to control the seas. And indeed, if you look at the U.S. maritime strategy, naval strategy, a lot of this goes back to Alfred Mann, who looked at the importance of controlling key sea routes. And now, at least since World War II, you had the U.S. controlling key choke points and key maritime corridors. And now you have this Arctic route. Now, I don't think it can, it's limits to how much traffic it can accommodate, obviously. But it is a corridor which is faster and cheaper well, once it matures. So, and also it could be the only corridor which falls then completely without outside of any U.S. control. Is this kind of the things
But it,
the politicians think of, or what?
but it no, but it doesn't. It doesn't. The eastern end of this corridor goes through the Bering Straits, which are between Siberia and Alaska, which is American. And it has to travel through the Aleutian Island, between the Aleutian Islands, which are mainly the 3/4 of them are American and have American bases on them. So it doesn't actually, provide a Chinese route immune to American pressure. And I mean, actually, when it comes to in the event of war, controlling the oceanic sea lanes, the American Navy can still do that. And that's not just to do with numbers and aircraft carriers, but it's also to do with bases and allies. America has 2, 3 major bases in the Indian Ocean. And if India were on its side as well, that it can control that. It can blockade China's entire maritime trade. For that matter, if America wanted to, it could blockade Russia's entire maritime trade. The American Navy can do that. What the American Navy almost certainly cannot do anymore is prevent China from blockading Taiwan because it's too close to China, and Chinese land-based missiles and drones would destroy an American fleet too close to China's shores. But the thing is, if you go back to the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, 19th centuries, you had Western naval forces which were so immeasurably superior to their Asian rivals that they could, and did continuously, simply blow them out of the water at no risk to themselves. All the way, yes, from the Portuguese smashing the Mughal fleet, such as it was, to the British destroying the Chinese junks in the First World War, when the British had a paddle steamer, which simply and armed with long-range cannon, which simply sailed around the Chinese junks who couldn't maneuver. They were sail-driven, blowing them to pieces from a distance to which they couldn't reply. Now, of course, it's not like that anymore. Russia has a fleet of nuclear submarines which are as good as our own. China in its own waters is by now probably immeasurably superior to the United States. But also, and we see this with the attempts to shut down Russia's maritime trade. The so-called shadow fleet of non-Russian ships carrying Russian energy and goods, because so far these moves have been limited. They've been limited to action within our territorial waters. If these ships actually come into our territorial waters, or try to enter our ports, and there have been a couple of occasions where, in that case, they have been seized. But it is being proposed, including in Sweden and in the Baltic states and by commentators elsewhere, that we should go much further than this. And, for example, in the Baltic, seize ships within the economic zones of Sweden and the Baltic states. Now, the thing is, the economic zones of Sweden and the Baltic states cover the entire central Baltic. Now, what that means is you are blockading Russia, St. Petersburg, and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad by sea. You are, in effect, imposing a blockade. Well, it's not just that Russia has threatened in that case to fight, to sink Swedish or Baltic ships trying to do that. But of course, there have been messages from India saying, look, hang on a second. We would, since many of these ships are heading for India, we would regard this as piracy on the high seas, just as you would if we were to try to do it to your vessels. So you see that the problem is, and this is where the rules-based order becomes tangled up and falls over itself, that we claim to be guarantors of free navigation, free trade on the high seas, security of the high seas, and this has been the moral or legal argument between America and Britain bombarding the Houthis in the Red Sea and objecting to China's claims in the South China Sea. But actually, the Chinese, as the greatest maritime trading power now, have the strongest possible national interest precisely in keeping these sea routes open. It is us who are beginning to undermine, if you like, the entire basis of our claim to global leadership, hegemony, and to the defense of the rules-based order by trying to, impose our will on international trade. Now, as I say, we could do that once upon a time when the British Navy or the Portuguese or the Dutch were unchallengeable, but we can't do it anymore. Not least without also bringing our own economic order down in ruins.
Yeah, they talk about, well, not just on the Russian side, but taking over Iranian tankers or threatening, I think it was, the former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen who was making the point that we can put a blockade on St. Petersburg. There's some arguments that, Denmark as well should start to intercept Russian commercial ships. It's just, this is very, this is very provocative. It throws out the entire system based on rules. I guess my last question.
And
Yeah.
if if this were to happen the other way around, if the Chinese were to seize American ships on the high seas, the Americans would sink them immediately. Well, think about it. You try to do that in the Baltic, and a Russian submarine or plane sinks a Swedish or Danish destroyer. And then where are you? Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, more than 100 years ago, used to say to his colleagues when they proposed things like this vis-a-vis other major countries, he said, spend a little time thinking. Are you prepared to fight over this issue? Are you prepared to go to war? If you're not, then don't take the first steps in that direction.
Well, on that note, though, do you have any projections, or how do you see the developments now going, and then especially in the Arctic? Do you see this possibly toning itself down once the Ukraine war is over, or or do you see a pathway to confrontation and war over the Arctic?
I don't see a pathway to war coming from the Arctic, because I don't think that there is any issue there, including the territorial issue, that would lead countries to war. I mean, it's not as if there are disputed islands with populations, or even without populations, in the Arctic that anyone, is potentially fighting over, like in the South China Sea, for example. No, but I mean, if war breaks out elsewhere, then it will inevitably spread to the Arctic. I mean, yes, my hope is that whenever the Ukraine war is over, that gradually reasonable relations will be restored, and that you will have a return to Arctic exceptionalism. But I mean, the other thing is, we don't know, and maybe by some miracle we will avoid it. But I'm quite convinced that within, at the very least, a few generations, I mean, certainly by the end of this century, the effects of climate change, including in or from the Arctic, will have become such that unless we've managed to destroy ourselves in the meantime with nuclear weapons, it will actually become evident to everybody that these issues that we've been fighting over are essentially not just secondary, but virtually irrelevant compared to the damage that climate change has begun to do to states and societies worldwide. I mean, my fear, of course, is that by the time we come to this realization, will only come as a result of greatly intensified climate change disasters, and that by the time we do come to this realization, it will be too late to do anything.
Yeah, that's a disadvantage of when the great power competition increases. One forgets about the other important issues such as the climate. But of course, sitting in Scandinavia, I tend to be a bit worried as well about how the whole region is being militarized. It appears that we are setting ourselves up for being a front line in the Arctic, which kind of undermines the whole period of the region as a zone of peace. But the main concern is possibly likely ignoring all of this climate change now. Anyways, thank you so much for your time. I would I really recommend that paper. I thought everyone should look towards the Arctic. It's a region in quick change, it seems.
And could I just recommend something else since you're there, which is oh, damn it, where's it gone? With me. But I wrote a whole book on the issue of climate change and security called Climate Change and the Nation State, the Realist Case, which is published by Penguin in the United Kingdom and OUP in America. So in which I set out these arguments about climate change as the real security threat to not just humanity in general, but to our own countries. Climate Change and the Nation State.
I'll add that as well in the description. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And I'll see you in about 9 days.
Oh, yes, that's great. See you then.
I look forward to it.
Bye.